So let's welcome Dr. McGregor.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good, because I felt like I was, I got to time myself here because Heidi and I both know we're between you and lunch now, so that's not that much fun. So I'm going to try to be 15 or 20 minutes. I did prepare a PowerPoint, but I know you can't see anything, but it's mostly my mnemonic. I'm not advanced or evolved like Alan, that I can do this off the top of my head. Otherwise, I go off topic and I talk till you start talking to you about neuroscience and other things you're probably not interested in, or why I was asked to be here. So, wasa se indigenous cause, makwa dodem, wepushuver, indojba, and Anishinaabe kwe. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about natural law, just building upon the events of yesterday and some of the work and words that I've learned from, well, basically you, like elders and knowledge keepers. I don't claim to have this knowledge myself. Like my job, I think, as an educator and working with people like Nelson and others and SUI facilitated gatherings over time is just to like learn as much as I can and then try to figure it out and try to convey it and teach it in other contexts. That's kind of what I do. So anything like super cool that I ever learned, I learned it in gatherings like this. Like really, it wasn't anything I read, unless I wrote it later and then read it. But but really, this is where I learn all the really cool stuff. And then I try to convey it. And most of my job, like it's actually a real honor to be here. And I'm not going to go through all the chimigueches because people did, but because really most of my job and I feel like my career is always trying to convince people that we have knowledge, that we have laws, that we have governance. Other ones aren't working so well because a lot of my work is environmental for the planet and others, and so I think I think a lot of the answers is in our own knowledge and in our own laws and in our own governance. So that's why I focus a lot on that in my work. So it's really cool to come and talk to you because anything I say collectively, you kind of already know. It's sort of like how I'm packaging it in my head and how I want to hopefully honor you with what I've heard you say. And again, like Alan, feel free to come and flesh out some of what I'm going to talk about. So slide 2, I don't even know what's behind me. Oh. So the virtual people are getting to see this. You don't because there's too much light. I shouldn't say that. There's the exact amount of light, but the technology is just not suitable. So don't be frustrated. This is my mnemonic. Otherwise, I'll still be here till lunchtime, and you won't like that. So the first slide just basically speaks to we've always been here. So a lot of the times in my work, I'm having to explain to people because the interest in our knowledge and the interest in our laws is recent, really kind of the last few decades. But really for us, we've been here for thousands of years. So we already know what other people are interested in. And it's actually really most of our history. So colonization has only been recent. It's not been fun, but it's really recent in terms of our history as Anishinaabe people. So I always like to remind people of that. It was our knowledge and our laws and our governance that was here. And we were caretaking for thousands of years. Next slide, please. So what you would have been seeing here is this idea of living well and our obligations to live well. And so I see this as very much relating to natural law. So in the sunrise ceremony yesterday morning, someone was telling the Pipe and the Eagle story, which actually right now happens to be one of my favorite stories. I see it as a climate change story, because that destruction is coming when people aren't living up to their obligations to care for the earth. Like that's why it's coming. And for me, part of natural law is being able to learn from, for lack of a better word, natural world. That's not the best word to use, all of creation. Because in that story, when the eagle petitions on our behalf, because they know that destruction is coming and the people are oblivious. So they're like not behaving properly and destruction's going to come, and the eagle's the one who petitions on our behalf at that Bedabin time, which is a really special time for it to be able to do that. So the animals know. And if you remember, I don't even remember how many years ago when the tsunami hit, it didn't affect indigenous peoples as much because they saw what the animals were doing. The animals were like hightailing it to high ground, and they went, ew, and they went. and other people didn't. So they hadn't, even people who hadn't seen it before knew that you had to learn from the animals and do what the animals were doing. So a lot of these stories tell us that. Like a lot of the stories have natural law in it. And there's probably better words for this other than natural law, but it's a word that I've heard so many times in different gatherings, like this. So the other thing about natural law that I'll say is that it actually has a lot of Anishinaabeg science behind it. The stories make sense ecologically. Like they make sense in terms of science and biology, and maybe I'll have time to get into that. So it drives me crazy when people make up stories and they don't make sense, like ecologically, because that's what we're also supposed to be learning in the story. We're learning the laws and governance, but also our own knowledge and also our own science and understanding of why the world is the way it is. So next slide, please. The earth-based laws and governance. I call it earth-based because it's also the waters, it's everything. It's the four elements, so it's more than the land. It's actually kind of everything around us. And this is just to draw a little bit on yesterday and some of the work, and Nelson and I we co-facilitated those gatherings with the elders because there needed to be someone fluent, and I'm not. I'm like whatever is tinier than Bungi in Anishinaabe, when that's me in terms of language. And so we needed Nelson. And really what came out of that gathering that's different, I find in a lot of the way that a lot of scholars write about First Nation law or Indigenous laws or Anishinaabe law, is it's very family-based. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my family. I told Earl, I'm not going to be academic. I do know how to talk like a human, so that's what I'm going to do. And this is where we learn a lot of our systems. And so if you're able to see it, you'd see a picture of my family in the sugar bush, because that's an important time for my family and community. And so there's so much knowledge that's involved in being in the sugar bush and sharing and a lot of, and to me, law that's embedded within that I'll get into in a few minutes. But it's also very family-based. So family is where a lot of elders and knowledge keepers, grandmothers, grandfathers said that's where they were learning knowledge, and that's where they practiced it. So our language is very verb-based. So I found in a lot of the work that I do, when you're too conceptual and theoretical, and you actually don't know how to enact that, we're not, what would be the word? To live responsibly is a verb. You have to verb these things. You have to verb our knowledge. You have to verb our law. So that's what a lot of it is. Once we're in the practice and once we're doing it, then we're living that law. It needs to be verbed. You need to act on it. And you also see this in the clan system. So I'm Makwa clan, wearing my mother's skirt. You can see that bear on there. Because I didn't have a fancy one. And so she gave me one. So I'm not going to be wrong here. If you don't like it, you can take it about my mom, and that won't go well for you. And so, it's also our clan system. So to be a responsible clan member also means that you understand, for me, the bear, what does it need to be well? What kind of nourishment does it need? How do you take care of it? What's the ecology that bear needs to be well? So you actually have to know that science. And that's what we knew. But it was part of our stories and how we understood our laws. Unfortunately, I find in the academic world, the people who do Anishinaabe knowledge, like me and others, don't necessarily talk to the people who do Anishinaabe law. And a lot of the times we're saying the same thing because we're very siloed. And so they're over here and we're over here. But really, a lot of the times we're talking about the same thing. But people in the communities do it together. So they already kind of know what we're trying to figure out a lot of the times. So next slide, please. Anishinaabe legal traditions. Sorry, I'm trying to get through this and stay on time. So again, this is drawing from the literature. This is what people say. Responsibilities at the heart of Anishinaabe legal structure. So this is a May Craft from out Treaty 3-Way. I know she helps with a lot of the Dimwe there and their water work. Law is about living and sharing it. And law is all around us. So we could look out and see the trees and natural laws happening right now as we speak. It's our experience living and observing the natural world and creation. So this comes from John Burroughs and Cecil King from Wikwemekong. And the law is read from the land. But what does that mean? You know, I have to kind of answer those questions. Like when my kids were small, they say, why is it the muskrat? There's actually very biological and ecological reasons why it's the muskrat, actually, because I had to answer the question. I didn't know. And I went, oh, actually, I don't know. That's the great thing about kids. They ask you these questions. But so I started to think about, what does that mean? How does it relate to family? And how did I learn about natural law from my family? And also the limits to what we know. And the reason I'm thinking about this is because I share a lot of the concern that people shared yesterday, and many of you have, about how are we teaching our children and young people to learn about our own laws and traditions and knowledge. And I think kids are able to do this, and unfortunately a lot of the times we kind of educate it out of them. I mean, I get them when they're about 18. And pretty well, it's very hard for them to learn anything from the land. And so I'm just going to tell you some stories about how I know the limits of my own knowledge and how I'm trying to learn natural law through the way that our ancestors would have done it. It wasn't through PowerPoint. And so this one is the first one is my uncle George Ba. And so we were driving back from Little Current, if you're familiar with the island, and we're coming into BI, and we can see the mountains, and it's a beautiful day. And so this is like 25 years plus, because my first son wasn't born yet. And he goes, oh, there's a big storm coming. And he wasn't the kind of person that you corrected and said, that's not what the Weather Channel says. Like, that's not what the forecast is. And I didn't say anything. And there was a big storm. And so we were literally looking at the same thing, but seeing something completely different, because he was fluent, he lived on the land, he helped his grandmother, who was a midwife, collect medicines. So even though we could see the same thing, we're looking at the mountains, I didn't see what he saw. So I have limits to how I can know. So how do I develop those senses? How do I develop the ability to be able to do that? But my mind kind of goes crazy. I'm like, ow, like maybe it was humid and there was a lot of moisture in the air and maybe it makes the mountains look bigger. But I actually don't even know if that's what he saw. Like, do they look smaller or bigger on other days? So he understood that. Like, he knew how to tell what was coming by looking at those mountains. Another one is my great uncle Eli. So this is where I live, and I look out at the water, and I'm not good at telling distance on water. I'm better on land. So I couldn't even tell you how many kilometers away that was, where they were. But the men were out in the village, because they used to ice fish this way, where they have the blankets over them, and they could see where the fish were, because the ice is so clear you can see underneath. A lot of you probably know those times. Harder to find now, because the snow insulates, and then it's all messy. And then so a lot of the men in the village are out there fishing at this time. And my uncle Eli comes out and says, obviously in Anishinaabe, get off the ice now. And then a half an hour later, the ice breaks up. So he saved all those people, so he knew to get them off that ice. So I think, because I do research, and again, I'm trying to explain to people, like, the depth of knowledge that people had and what the reality was like everything that he would have been paying attention to. So scientists would come in, probably talk to all the men, talk to my uncle, get meteorological data. What was the weather like? What was the wind like? Did you hear any certain birds? They'd be looking for indicators, right? How thick was the ice? What was going on? So we could do all this research, and I could even, probably wouldn't be me, because I don't do that kind of scientific research. I do the interviews and present it to you, but you wouldn't trust me on that ice. Like, you would know, I don't know it the way my great uncle Eli did, right? And I wouldn't either. Like, I wouldn't take you out there and I think it's going to happen in a half an hour. Like people knew things at a level that we need to learn again. And I think kids have that, because that's part of the teachings. Like, you know how they kind of stare off into space because they can see things and we can't? Because I think they're able to do that. But our ancestors, and probably many of you in the room, know how to do that. And so I'm working on that and trying to figure that out, or someone like Josephine Mondaman who listens to the water. I mean, I could hear the waves, but that's not what she means. Like that ability to be able to listen to the water. So next slide, please. This might be the last point I'll be able to make. So again, like how do you take those really kind of abstract, kind of theoretical ideas like natural law, and what do they mean in practice? So this is, again, in our family bush, and my brother's here. Is he still? Oh, there he is. Okay, so he works in the bush. He was probably part of these chats and discussions. So at one time, not that long ago, there was talk about, so we still like haul the sap and have the big iron pots, which is actually good for you because there's iron in there and it goes into the syrup. It's good for you. We need iron. And they wanted to, I don't know exactly who they were, family, wanted to, whatever it is they do in maple bushes where they hook them all up to hook up the trees and have a central place that it's collected and whatever else that they do. It was a student once who told me, that's called a pipeline system. And I went, that's really ironic that it's called a pipeline system. And, just to make it easier, because now it's hard to get people out consistently to take care of the bush, because that's what you're doing. You have to be there every day, and it's a certain time of year, and the weather has to be right. And my dad said, no, because and maybe some of you know this concept, but my dad's passed away, because I kicked myself for not really exploring this further with him while he was alive, and what he said was, no, we're not going to do that, because what we're doing in the sugar bush is we're receiving this gift from this tree. And when you do the pipeline thing, you're taking. So to me, there's a big difference between receiving a gift and taking something. And I see that as being natural law. Because as many of you know, because we all probably experienced this in different places, and because of the place I work, I might experience it more than you, is this idea that, oh, well, those people were just too primitive. They didn't have the technology to do all this damage. Well, we could have, but we didn't. Like, we chose not to because we had our laws and principles about how we were going to be. So, learning how to receive this gift was part of that natural law in being in the sugar bush. And a lot of this, I realize, I'm learning from my family. So if you move to the next slide, we'll skip this one because we talked about it yesterday. That's lawmaking. We'll go to the principles of lawmaking, because when we had those tech elders groups, we had people talk about what does lawmaking look like. A lot of the times we're studying the law, like the noun, but what about the verb? What is it like when you're doing it? What is it like when you're creating it? And some of the principles of lawmaking that came from those gatherings was, it must involve spirit and ceremony. We've heard that, and we've done that here. Must involve youth, because they're the future generations. Learning from families, and learning the discipline of sharing and listening. So when you're visiting out there, you're engaging in natural law and learning from the earth and using our senses and trying to develop them in the way that our ancestors would have. So I think we're going to have to jump maybe to maybe stories is ecological knowledge. If you go to that slide. So it's jumping. Probably the people who are on hybrid kind of have a headache as we're flipping through these slides. Stories is ecological knowledge. In our stories is natural law. There's a lot of ecological knowledge. For many years, the recreation story was one of my favorite stories that Al talked about, that soil coming out. Then my son said, why is it the muskrat? I actually couldn't answer the question, even though I love that story. I mean, there's humility, muskrat, they have compassion for sky woman. Like, there's so many other values in that story, but there's also the ecology. But the muskrat is like a really, I guess, brilliant animal. When it's diving, it can lower its heart rate, it can hold its breath. So that story makes sense when you understand the biology of the muskrat. It can do that better than the other water creatures. So in a lot of our stories, and it's in some of the versions of the story, the muskrat is then gifted with being able to survive when it's experiencing disruption. So it adapts. So we learn from the muskrat in this story, and so I started to think about our stories, and I'm like, oh, what is our other knowledge behind these stories, right? We have our own science because we were here for thousands of years, and of course we had knowledge to help us govern and develop our laws. So when I'm paying attention to stories, that's what I'm looking at. So if you go to the listening to the earth one, because I am running out of time, and so apologies for that. But we're around. You can chat with us, and I love to talk about this stuff, so I'm happy to chat with people about this kind of stuff. So listening to the earth. So how am I trying to apply natural law? So I talked about how I'm like literally trying to do this in my life. I'm like, every time I come from Little Current, even to this day, I'm looking at it. What did my uncle see? What did my great uncle Eli understand? My father used to also be able to smell the weather. No idea. I live in Toronto. The compost truck goes by and I just smell sticks. So I know how to smell, but I don't know how to smell the weather, right? So these are things I'm trying to, like, how did he know these things? Like there's knowledge and then there's knowing, like verbing it. Like how does it become a reality in our lives? So listening to the earth. So some of the work I'm doing right now, and it's actually based on the Pipe into Eagle story, because I see that as a climate change story. Because Anishinaabe faced our destruction and annihilation before. That's what colonization did, and we survived it. So we can, and everyone else is starting to face it, and they're all panicking about it. And I'm like, we've been there, and we've come out the other end, right? And a lot of that survival, those gifts that were being abused in that story, depending on the version that you've heard, but it's our own knowledge, and it's our own spirit, and it's our own ceremony that enables us. Like it's our own being in Anishinaabe that enables us to be able to survive destruction, and the animals helping us. Like so, the eagle petitions on our behalf. The muskrat helps. So in a lot of our stories, it's our relatives who actually bail us out when we're not clever enough to figure it out ourselves. So that's very humbling as an academic. When I go to climate science meetings and I tell people that, they don't want to sit at my table anymore. Like I'm just like, I don't think we're that smart. I think we need to go to the natural world to sort of get our answers. And they're just like, we don't want to sit with that whack job. But so sit by myself at the table with except there's other Indigenous people, they get it. But the weird thing is in climate change policy in Canada, they call it nature-based solutions, where the solutions are coming from the natural world. But it's very bizarre. It's not like the way we understand it at all. It's like counting trees that are planted in parks in Toronto kind of thing. It's not like the way we understand. So in the work that I'm doing, I'm following the 13 moon cycle, which is from those gatherings we had with elders, is also natural law, because it's coming, so it doesn't matter whether you're in your community or whether it's the Robinson-Huron Treaty level, the full moon's going to come. She's going to come. And so I'm using I shouldn't say that, I'm working with the full moon as a way to understand those changes that happened, like what is a normal change versus when that's brought on by climate change. Because when I'm in these different spaces, they say, well, you don't have baseline. You don't have a scientific baseline. I go, yeah, we do. It's the 13 moon. People know exactly what was supposed to happen at what time. And if that's not happening, then we know there's a difference. So we actually do have that knowledge. We actually do have this knowledge that other people say that we don't. And I know that we do. So that's what I'm trying to do right now, is connect the land to the moon and to our teachings and our clan system in terms of natural law. And having said that, I am such a beginner, and I always get excited to listen to elders and people speak the language, because I try to pick out the words and try to understand to the best of my ability to learn this. So we'll just go to the Love and Shkekma quest slide. I'm going to finish here. I talked about this yesterday. People talked about it when we had the Tech Elders gatherings pre-pandemic. Yesterday it came up, is a lot of the times we do what we do because of love. Because right now, we're all descendants of our Anishinaabe ancestors who were part of that treaty. And whatever they negotiated, and Alan had a great story for that, that's so we could be here and meet as a nation and have this discussion. So I'm a descendant, so I have to think about future generations. All the work that I do, how do I show love for future generations? How do I make sure that 172 years from now, they can gather and discuss the treaty and be Anishinaabe? So I think that's an important John Burroughs writes about this as being a legal principle, but you would have already known that because we just listen to you and go, oh, and then we write about it and tell people about it. And so I do think as descendants, we have these obligations to future generations to show love for them. So Chimigwech, hopefully that made sense. I did rush through it, but I appreciate your feedback. And welcome to our guests. I'd like to hear from them too, because I know we share some of the same stories. And yeah, so Heidi's up next, so she's between you and lunch. Thank God it's not me. And Chimigwech to all of you.